Good evening, everyone. My name is Ian Kenny, Program and Development Coordinator at the John Adams Institute, and it is a pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of our entire team and our partners at the Rode Hoed, without whom this program would not have been possible, to this very special event, Who Owns the Future? A conversation about technology, about imagination and inequity in the 21st century. A heartfelt thanks to our longtime sponsors at Aegon, whose support has helped us at the John Adams host bold and necessary conversations for nearly as long as our small organization has existed. And tonight is no exception. We are deeply grateful to have you with us here tonight. We're also proud to welcome a new partner to our community, the American Book Center. They'll be joining us at, a round of applause for the American Book Center. We recently signed an exclusive partnership with them, and they'll be joining us at all future John Adams events as our booksellers. So please visit their table at the end of this evening to get your hands on tonight's featured titles. And do stay tuned for more from our ABC and John Adams collaboration. We have a lot of fun stuff that we're cooking up, and we're excited to share with you soon. Tonight's conversation is one that the John Adams and the Rode Hoed have been building toward for months, nearly a year actually, about what kind of future we're walking into and whose vision is shaping it. We are honored to welcome our keynote speaker, Ruha Benjamin, professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. And it is no stretch of the imagination to say that Ruha is a visionary scholar. She's a writer and also an educator. And she's the founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, which brings together artists, activists, educators, technologists, and students to rethink how data is conceived and used, and more importantly, to imagine how it might serve justice. Ruha is the author of many books, among them Race After Technology, People's Science, and most recently, Imagination, a Manifesto. She's also one of this year's MacArthur Genius Fellows, and we are thrilled to have her here in Amsterdam tonight. But before we jump in, I want to pause, because that's exactly what Ruha invites us to do, to stop and to imagine. She begins her book, Imagination, with a quote from the peerless Toni Morrison, "Dream a little before you think." And this isn't whimsical escapism, it is a call to recalibrate, to resist the idea that the future is something we simply inherit. Ruha asks, what happens if we approach imagination not as a luxury, but as a muscle? Not as fantasy, but as method? Because let's face it, tech already shapes how we live, work, love, and vote. But the apps and tools we use every day are not neutral. They are designed by people with specific assumptions and worldviews and incentives. And if we don't question them, if we don't imagine alternatives, then someone else will imagine them for us. Ruha challenges us to think beyond the binary of utopia or dystopia, and she asks us to think otherwise, to imagine systems that heal rather than harm, technologies that serve justice rather than replicate bias, and tools that amplify dignity and not division. And imagination, as she reminds us, is not a solo act. It is something that we do together. And that's why, after Ruha's keynote, we'll open a wider conversation. Joining her on the stage will be two extraordinary voices. Marietje Schaake, International Policy Director at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center, author of The Tech Coup, and former member of the European Parliament. She's one of the leading voices around the world today calling for democratic oversight of big tech. And Robin Aïsha Pocornie, computer scientist and AI ethics pioneer who made legal history in the Netherlands by challenging facial recognition software that failed to recognize her face. And her work at the intersection of tech and social justice is reshaping how institutions right here in the Netherlands think about bias and equity. Moderating tonight's conversation is someone we are very lucky to have with us, Nienke Venema, director of the Stichting Democratie en Media. And under her leadership, SDM supports independent journalism and democratic values through media ownership and strategic funding. The foundation traces its roots all the way back to the founders of Het Parool, the resistance newspaper started during the Second World War. So before we get going, one practical note, we'll be taking your questions via Slido tonight. Well, that felt great. You can all scan the QR code on the screen or go to the URL listed and enter your questions as they arise. Please don't forget to put in the session code, the thing starting with 2 and ending with 3. And near the end of the event, my colleague Sean will share your questions with our panel. He'll be acting on behalf of you all as the voice of the audience. And after audience questions, John Adams director Tracy Metz will close the evening with a look at our program from September onward. So let's begin. Please join me in welcoming Ruha Benjamin to the stage. Thank you, Ruha. Success.
Thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic live? Awesome. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you, Ian, Kenny, and the entire John Adams team for inviting me, for gathering us in this beautiful, beautiful space. And deepest gratitude also to the moderator for this evening and my fellow panelists. I'm so excited to be in conversation. So I am going to get through my presentation, which will be about 20 minutes, and then we'll transition here. I'm sure, like me, many of you have borne witness to the bravery of those aboard the Madeleine Freedom Flotilla and those traveling across North Africa to break the siege of Gaza. In my hometown of Los Angeles and across the US, everyday people have taken to the streets to resist the terror unleashed on immigrant communities. And just down the street, tens of thousands of Red Line protesters gathered in The Hague this weekend, again, to call an end to the Palestinian genocide. Across this warming planet, more and more people are demonstrating courage, conviction, love, and solidarity in the face of growing authoritarianism and oppression across this planet. In the process, technologies of empire, technologies of war and surveillance are not only being questioned and critiqued, but actively resisted and reimagined, even as the powers that be are working overtime to convince us that democracy is an outmoded software. If I had to boil down the stakes of our conversation tonight, I'd say it's this question: who owns the future? And for the Trekkies in the room, hopefully you recognize who this is. Or more precisely, what values, knowledges, aspirations, and desires, worldviews, are guiding or colonizing our shared future? I think it should give us pause that some of the very same people hyping AI as the solution to all of our problems are often the ones causing those problems to begin with. Take J.D. Vance, who at the Paris AI Summit a few months ago stated that, quote, "Our schools will teach students how to manage, how to supervise, how to interact with AI-enabled tools as they become more and more a part of our lives." The same J.D. Vance, who gave a speech in 2021 titled, "The Universities Are the Enemy." In his words, if any of us want to do the things we want to do for this country and for the people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities. More recently, anti-DEI crusader Chris Rufo, in describing his self-proclaimed counter-revolution blueprint, said that in attacking the US Department of Education, the Trump administration must go after the ideological programs, the grants for critical race theory, gender ideology, liberatory pedagogy. Whatever you may have, all of that just needs to be burned to the ground. I mean, really, truly, it needs to be gutted and dismantled. Likewise, founder of the anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic philosophical movement known as the Dark Enlightenment, a character by the name of Curtis Yarvin, who has the ear of many Silicon Valley elites. Yarvin argues that, quote, "The most powerful people in the West today, measured strictly by their ability to influence the real world are journalists and professors. I know the professors in the room definitely don't feel that powerful, but they think we are. Finally, in describing students, who we can see as putting that liberatory pedagogy into action by opposing, for example, a US-funded genocide. Palantir CEO Alex Karp said, quote, "We kind of think these things that are happening on college campuses are a sideshow. No, they are the show. Because if we lose the intellectual debate, you will not be able to deploy an army in the West ever." My point, again, is that we should think carefully about the fact that these so-called guardians of the galaxy are the ones causing the problems against which we must guard. And two, if those attacking higher education understand the dangers of liberatory learning, then we sure as hell need to embrace its power for social transformation. So while we continue to be sold a never-ending barrage of fantasies and fears, two sides of the same Bitcoin, I want to draw our attention to another kind of AI, ancestral intelligence. That is the knowledge and know-how born under the rubble of progress, the kind of intelligence lacking in those Dr. King referred to when speaking to an auditorium full of students at Stanford over 60 years ago, said, "We have guided missiles and misguided men," though I think misguided is putting it mildly. Ancestral intelligence goes hand in hand with yet another kind of AI that I want to dig more into this evening, and that is abundant imagination. So while ancestral intelligence is about what we inherit, abundant imagination is about what we pass down to future generations, a point to which I'll return. But first, I thought I'd share with you how I came to think seriously about the role of imagination in our lives. It was about 15 years ago when I was starting my first job as a professor, and I was trying to learn everything that I could about teaching because somehow they skipped that part in grad school. So I came across this famous study that was conducted by NASA that was focused on creativity. These researchers were interested in measuring the capacity for what they termed divergent thinking. That is, the ability to see beyond what's right in front of us and come up with many different ways of thinking through a problem. So they followed a cohort of 1,600 children over many years, and every year gave them a creativity test that was originally designed for NASA recruits. And the results for them were shocking, in that nearly 100% of 5-year-olds fell into the genius category for divergent thinking. More shocking still was that every year that number dropped, until only 12% of 15-year-olds and 2% of adults exhibited this creative capacity. In other words, this inherent genius that we all possess is schooled out of us. The very place we should be able to go to incite our imagination is the place where it's routinely squashed, ground down, standardized. Not inevitably, but predictably. And it's not just the individual students who suffer, it's society as a whole. When we don't heed Morrison's words, as you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. So what if we took imagination seriously? Not as flights of fancy or something only reserved for self-proclaimed artists, but again, imagination as a muscle, a capacity, a resource. How might the powers of our collective imagination begin to transform the world around us? So to explore these questions, we're going to try a little exercise. Requires us to split the room in half. So for those of you in the fuzzy middle right here, just decide which side you want to belong to, all right? So this side, your catchphrase when I point to you is be bold. And I want you to shout it in unison like you're trying to shoot me like a rocket in the sky. Are you ready? Go.
Be bold.
Excellent. On the first try. This side, your catchphrase is get real. And I want you to say it like the boredest teenager ever, okay? Ready?
Get real.
Perfecto. Now, here we go. Space travel. Free public transportation. Colonize Mars. Decolonize Earth. AI superintelligence. Cancel student debt. Build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse. Build affordable housing for all. Spend millions on weapons and war. Invest in peace and well-being for all. You get the picture. Boldness is rationed, while realism is mass-produced. We are in many ways trapped inside a lopsided imagination of those who monopolize power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Now, these futurists, they let their own imaginations run wild when it comes to bending our digital and physical realities. But their visions grow limp when it comes to transforming our social reality so that everyone has the chance to live a good and meaningful life. So what will it take for us to be bold when it comes to our social visions? For starters, I think it requires that pause that Ian mentioned. Slowing down, as in this insight from Tony Cade Bambara, not all speed is movement. Now, I apply this insight to so many areas of my life, both personal, professional, but here, I want us to think about it in light of technological speed, the race to create bigger, faster, shinier systems, and all of the things that we skip over, the questions we don't ask, the communities we don't consult. Here you see two images, one from a prior era of racial domination in the US, educational apartheid. On your right is from the first few weeks of the pandemic. Students were sent home, they couldn't take those all-important exams. In the UK context where this image was taken, they couldn't take their A-levels, which are really consequential for getting into uni. And so the government decided to use an algorithm to predict their grades. Predictably, students that went to more working class schools, more diverse schools, their grades were predicted as lower than their wealthier, whiter counterparts. And you see they had a lot of poetic things to say about those algorithms. One sign in particular is very instructive. Here, she's reminding us our grades should not equal or do not equal our postal codes. Why is this important? Because it reminds us that the algorithm, the technology, isn't creating the problem from scratch. It's reflecting and reproducing existing forms of inequity encoded in the geography of the city, of the nation, so that any conversation about technology can't start with the technology. We often think about the impacts of this or that technology, ChatGPT, facial recognition, but that assumes the technology is a given, and then we look at its impacts. Where we have to start is with the society and its inputs, what is then reflected in and reproduced by these digital systems. So we have to widen the lens, the frame of our analysis, and not begin the story in the middle with the technology, but with the social context that then is getting reproduced in these systems. When we do that, when we widen the lens, one of the things we realize is that there are two powerful stories that are told and that we end up telling about this relationship between society and technology. The first story On your left is the techno-dystopian narrative. The idea that the robots, here the robots are a kind of shorthand for emerging technologies more broadly, the robots are going to slay us. They're going to take all the jobs, they're going to rob us of our agency, everything bad is associated with technology. And of course, this is the narrative that Hollywood loves to sell us, right? The Terminator, the Matrix, the list goes on. On your right is what we would call the techno-utopian narrative. The idea that these systems are going to save us. They're going to make everything more efficient, more fair. If only we would hand over our decisions to these automated systems, we'd be in better hands. And of course, this is the narrative that Silicon Valley works 24/7 to sell us. Now, these seem like opposing narratives, don't they? One in which we're slayed, one in which we're saved. They have different endings, but they actually share an underlying logic, what we would call techno-deterministic logic, which is just a fancy way of saying that we are assuming technology's in the driver's seat, propelled by a will of its own. It impacts us, but the humans behind the screen are missing from both of those scripts. The values, the ideologies, the desires even that are getting coded into our digital world. And as it stands, as our exercise demonstrated, it's a small sliver of humanity that's actually imposing its vision on the rest of us. And so we have to pull back the screen and not assume that these technologies have a life of their own. And when we do, we have to not only be critical of what we're seeing behind the screen, but we also want to take the next step and be creative. Not only to look at what's harmful, but to think about what would actually be life-affirming. How might we actually do things differently, design differently, with values that ensure that everyone has the chance to thrive, so that in shifting from artificial intelligence AI to abundant imagination AI means that creativity has to go hand in hand with critique. So that we ask ourselves, again, if not this version of society with all of its tech-mediated injustices, then what? One of my favorite examples of this idea of combining criticality and creativity is this white-collar crime early warning system developed by artist Sam Levine. So this is a parody project that begins by subverting that racist logics embedded in new high-tech approaches to crime prevention. Instead of using predictive policing techniques to forecast so-called street crime, this flips the script by creating a heat map that flags city blocks where financial crimes are likely to occur. And you can actually download this app on your phone before you leave, so next time you travel, New York, for example, Wall Street will light right up. The system not only brings the hidden but no less deadly crimes of capitalism into view, but it includes an app that alerts users when you've entered high-risk areas to encourage awareness and vigilance. Taking it one step further, this team proposes a facial recognition program to flag individuals who are likely perpetrators. And the training set used to design this algorithm includes the profile photos of 7,000 corporate executives downloaded from LinkedIn. Not surprisingly, the averaged face of a criminal is white and male. To be sure, creative exercises like this are only comical if we ignore that all of its features are drawn directly from actually existing proposals and practices that target racialized individuals in the real world, in our cities and at our borders. But again, artists like this are not the only ones with creative vision. As abolitionist poet Walida Imarisha writes, anytime we try to envision a different world without poverty, prisons, capitalism, war, we're engaging in science fiction. This includes those building worker movements within the tech industry, insisting that tech won't build it, no tech for ICE, no tech for tyrants, among other campaigns calling for companies to cease providing technology and software services that enable oppressive policies and practices, from mass deportations in LA to ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Here in Europe, I've been learning about the work of Abolish Frontex. The aim of this campaign is not to reform or improve Frontex or to replace it with more of the same. Instead, organizers are working to dismantle the border industrial complex while working towards a society where people are free to move and live. The word abolition, after all, contains the possibility for both uprooting and seeding. Abolere, inviting us to ask what we would need to grow to make our world more habitable and just. Abolish Frontex is part of a growing global movement from Internet Freedom Foundation in India, Hamle in Palestine, Surveillance Watch, and Take Back Tech, among many others. At Take Back Tech's conference in Chicago last summer, I witnessed how organizers from around the world are creatively confronting the coercive power of tech oligarchs, from those like the Athena Coalition that are fighting data center construction, to those like May 1st Movement Technology, which is building autonomous technology infrastructure so that we don't have to rely on the likes of Google or Meta. Technology in this way is not closing off possibilities, predicting behavior, surveilling movement, colonizing the future. Instead, these initiatives put technology in service to liberatory visions of collective healing and world-making. Instead of trying to make harmful systems a little less harmful, what if we worked to completely reimagine them, envisioning a world beyond borders, beyond policing, surveillance, and supremacy? And in the process, I think we have to work on dismantling the walls in our own minds, that little voice that tells us to get real every time we try to imagine otherwise. As when architect Ronald Rael imagines binational libraries, shown here, where people share information and knowledge and where the border becomes nothing more than a bookshelf. Or his design of a teeter-totter that cuts across the US-Mexico border, where the actions on one side have a direct consequence on what happens on the other. After all, Rael implores, the wall is cutting through people's lives. From architecture to augmented reality. One final example I'll share is the Phoenix of Gaza immersive experience, created by and for Palestinians and those who believe in the seemingly radical notion that all life is sacred. It invites us to walk around a virtual Gaza captured with 360-degree cameras before and after the most recent devastation. You get to look directly into the smiling faces of children playing in a park, standing next to a teenager reciting poetry passionately on the sidewalk, peeking over the shoulder of elderly women in a sewing circle, and walking through the rubble of once magnificent churches, mosques, bathhouses. In this way, the Phoenix of Gaza team is preserving images of physical structures, cultural events, arts, dance, religious sites, and in the process, they're also imagining a world beyond settler colonialism, beyond apartheid and genocide, in order ultimately to return and rebuild. Taken together, all of these initiatives invite us to stop agonizing about a coming dystopia or longing for a future utopia, but rather to reckon with ustopia. Whereas utopias are the stuff of dreams, dystopias the stuff of nightmares, ustopias are what we create together when we're wide awake. So in that spirit, I want to leave you with one final provocation inspired by one of my favorite writers, Octavia E. Butler, writer and builder of speculative worlds. And that is this: it may be the end of the world, but there are other worlds. Thank you so much.
Yes, who owns the future? Thank you so much, Ruha, for your presentation. It was thought-provoking and inspiring and poetic at the same time. Incredible. Welcome also to Robin Aïsha Pocornie and to Marietje Schaake. For the upcoming 45 minutes, we will explore the growing tension between technological innovation and accountability. From big picture visions and imagination to policy-level solutions, who owns our future? Together with our speakers, I will dive into the urgent questions about how to reclaim the future of technology for everyone. And to start, I have a couple of questions to get to know all of you and your work a little bit better. Let's start with you, Ruha. Your previous books have explored how technology can perpetuate racial bias and social inequities. And how would you now revisit your 2019 book, I think it was, Race After Technology, given the current state of play of global politics?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think about that a lot. If I was writing it in 2025, what would be different? And in many ways, I think my analysis and my conclusions in 2019 compared to what we face today were really mild. You know, at the time, it struck a chord because we were just in the midst of what some have called a techlash, that is a broad awakening to the harms associated with the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few companies that wield more than many nation states. And so we were in the kind of twilight of that. And so I think at that time, the kind of ideas and examples I was offering sort of matched that moment. But there are two big buckets, I would say, that I didn't address at all, really, in that book that I think are even more pressing today when it comes to these types of issues. One is the labor behind the screen. You know, more and more journalists are starting to bring that to the fore. That is, what we experience as something that's automated actually takes armies of people, often whose labor is exploited. You know, whether it's content moderators in the Philippines or click workers in Kenya or Amazon workers even who are working in warehouses where algorithms are automating the pace of their work. So many dimensions to what some have called the ghost work that actually animates these systems, or as Bezos would call it, artificial intelligence, that is human labor. So there are many things around that are patterned by race, nation state, by gender and class, by ability, that I think map onto the examples that I did write about, but that I think take a very much more intense dimension now. The other bucket that many of you will also kind of be privy to are the ecological costs associated with the intensity of these. And I mentioned briefly those who've been fighting data centers in different parts of the world. When we think about the water consumption, the energy consumption, now we're starting to see people very tangibly see their utility bills go up when they live near some of these places. Closer to home for me in Memphis, where Musk has just, behind the scenes, built a giant facility in cahoots with the local government. The environmental justice dimension of that, because of who lives close to this data center, are, again, predictable in terms of race and class. And so I would say the labor and ecological, or we might say the people and the planetary costs around this, I didn't really dive into at the time. And now we have scholars, journalists, organizers, activists that are really taking these head on. And I would say that would be a big change if I was writing in 2025.
Thank you. So 2 extra dimensions you would add to that book. All right, thank you so much. Marietje, you also recently published a book, last October, I believe, or September, The Tech Coup, in which you argue that big tech companies have effectively staged a quiet takeover of our democratic institutions and processes, even though they have no democratic mandate or the moral qualifications to do so. And with the new Trump-Vance government and its ties to moguls like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, this has become more urgent than ever. Could you walk us through what this coup looks like in practice, and perhaps tell us a little bit about how these recent political developments have shaped your view?
Yes, so indeed, 9 months is already, a tidal wave compared to where we came from. And I think just building on what Ruha's excellent presentation brought to us this evening, we may have suffered from a lack of imagining the worst as well. So, I mean, I am inspired by what you say about staying clear of the possibility of building alternative futures, including in tech. But I think one of the conclusions has to be that we all bought into the worlds that were sold to us by these Silicon Valley moguls who told us that they were building democratizing technology, that they were emancipating people, that they were uplifting the unheard voices, that they were going to empower people from the Middle East to, the streets of our own societies. And of course, this has all, including the latest trend to keep talking about the need to protect the freedom of expression, been a gigantic lie. And so I think we have stepped into their story without thinking critically, without assuming the worst case scenarios. Because if you sit in Silicon Valley, where I've spent the last 5 years working, the people who are well off there, and of course the majority is not, but the people who built this technology by and large are in solid positions. The world actually looks like a great place. And if you were a person who was about 20 years old with a wild idea, and then 10, 15 years later, you have raised billions, if not tens of billions of dollars, you feel enforced in the idea that this was an excellent idea. Anyway, our lack of imagination has brought us to where we are, which is a very explicit marriage between US politics and state power and those with tech, including crypto or venture capital interests, that now makes it very clear to a lot of people what I was trying to bring to people's attention, which is there is a tech coup, an illegitimate grab of power at the expense of the rule of law and our democratic values and rights. And so I think on the one hand, it's been helpful that it's now so explicit. I mean, a lot of people are aware. My mom moved from WhatsApp to Signal at 78 years old, change is happening. But on the other hand, we have to be careful again to not fall for the idea that this is a Musk problem and that now that Musk is gone, the problem is gone, because it's not. It's a systemic threat we're facing. We can go into it deeper. I mean, data centers are a part of it, but so is all the communication stack, anything from satellites to social media that are steered in ways that have geopolitical agendas that may not and increasingly don't support the rule of law. So what has changed over the past 9 months is that for a lot of people, the sense of urgency has grown. But I think we have to be careful that we keep digging below the surface, because if we only think that it's about the guys that were lining the front rows of Trump's inauguration, we're mistaken once more.
So, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. So we need to imagine that dystopic future to be able to come to an ustopia as well. Absolutely. Thank you. Robin, you made legal history. I thought that was a beautiful way of putting it. Your groundbreaking case against the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam revealed how facial recognition technology can perpetuate systemic discrimination, and even in educational settings. Can you tell us a little bit about the case and what the final verdict has been, but also what would you say is the most pertinent insight that stuck with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't have a book, but I do have a story.
Yes.
I don't have a book.
So it's very hard to imagine now. I feel like we have this collective essence of forgetting that 5 years ago this would not be possible because we would be in lockdown. And 5 years ago I was in lockdown like everyone else and many other students. I had just started my new master's in bioinformatics, computational biology. If you're interested, talk to me after. And all exams were online. So that was all done with this online surveillance software. I call it spyware because it really just was. It would record your noise or the sounds in your room, your face at all times, your movements. And during your exams, you were totally monitored as if you were in an exam hall taking your exams. And in order to get into the software, you had to log in, not only with your password and your name, but also with your face. And what happened is that students of color, that students with a darker skin tone could not get into the software, meaning they couldn't do their exams. This happened to me. I had to shine a lamp in my face in order to actually get into the software, even though it was broad daylight. And long story short, it wasn't right, and I went to the university and I couldn't get any acknowledgement or recognition for the fact that implementing an algorithm like this mandatorily in extreme circumstances during COVID is not something a public institution should be doing. So together with the Reimagined Technology Center, which 3 people are here, founders of are here, I did not do this alone. Naomi, Jill, and Hans supported me every step of the way. We filed a complaint at the Dutch Human Rights Institute, for Dutch people, College voor de Rechten van de Mens. We filed a complaint that the implementation of this algorithm in public institutions, namely universities, was discriminatory and therefore should not be allowed. And half a year after filing this complaint, we had a very good and groundbreaking interim verdict which acknowledged algorithmic discrimination as something that exists, because by human rights law, you're not allowed to discriminate, and thus an algorithm that distinguishes between people at the basis of skin color is a way of discriminating. The fact that I lost time or that I had to shine a lamp in my face was extra bad, but it was outside of the human rights law scope. Not even an issue, because just in general you were not allowed to implement it. So a year later, the university had to do counter evidence to show that they weren't actually discriminating by implementing this software. And a year later, the final verdict was a total 180. They did not at all acknowledge the foundation or the grounds of their interim verdict, and they just said Ms. Pocornie was able to do her exams in the end, and therefore the conditions under which she did them do not matter, and discrimination did not take place. And that was when we got that final verdict, I thought about it yesterday for some reason, very randomly, and I was like, oh my God, I was so sad. That was so sad. But it also really showed something that's super important, because I feel like if we won it, it would have just been another great landmark case. Okay, see, discrimination is bad, and now we have proven that, and we have to alter the software, or some techno-solutionist way of looking at what should come after. But because we lost it, it showed how difficult it is to show the algorithmic discrimination within the legal system that we have today, and how volatile that is, and how bureaucracy and things behind the scenes that we don't have eyes on can really, really affect people's lives. And it also helped me to come to terms with that the solution is not a techno-solutionist way, so just altering the software, the algorithm is enough. It's really about who is responsible for implementing it. Should we implement it in the first place? These questions need to be asked before we even consider implementing spyware in public institutions, or anywhere really, but especially in public institutions. So that's my story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and that is also an insight, I think, that is really important for us all to take away from your story.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So let's move to imagination, because that's what we all came here for as well, I think. Ruha, in your book you state that, and I'm going to quote you, imagination by definition takes many different forms. You say that you refuse to police the parameters of imagination. You say, I want more than anything for your imagination to run wild. What drew you to focus on imagination as your central theme this time, and what to you makes it so powerful?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It really grew out of Race After Technology. At the time when that book came out and I was sort of making the rounds and having public discussions about it, you kind of have to distill what are the main takeaways. And so even though I didn't squarely address imagination in that 2019 book, one of the three nuggets that I wanted readers to take away had to do with this idea that imagination is a battlefield. It's not just the realm of the arts. It's something that is kind of a tacit part of our society and our culture. And for me, I think policy is important. I think these kind of legal issues are important. And fortunately, we have brilliant people addressing those. I, as an educator, tend to see my sandbox as thinking about how culture and our interactions and our relationships lead up to accumulate to these larger structures and get frozen or codified in different ways. So I wanted a way to name the kind of battle, not as a policy battle or a legal battle, but as something that's more in the realm of culture and the way that our values and ideas shape everyday life, often invisibly behind the scenes. And so for me, imagination became a way to kind of a placeholder for that. And I think although in this context we're talking about high tech and AI, I really wanted us to understand that imagination shapes very mundane areas of our lives too, things that we don't necessarily associate with being imaginative. And so, for example, a city budget, how we allocate money, and to what ends, to what communities, investing in what or divesting from others. Like thinking about an Excel sheet that I could put on a slide to show you where and how the money is allocated. Certain kinds of imagination help shape that in terms of where we should invest, who we want to thrive. In the US context, when it comes to education, if I showed you a slide in terms of where different schools, where they get their money, how much money they get, we would see a very clear pattern in terms of how much money kids in poor neighborhoods are receiving versus their wealthy counterparts. That, to me, is evidence of what I call in the book a eugenics imagination, going back to the fact that imagination is not a straightforward good. There are all kinds of harmful, deadly forms of imagination that infect our institutions and our interactions. And so when you look at how young people, how our local and state and federal governments invest in their potential very differently, there is already judgments being made in terms of who we want to thrive, who we see as gifted, who we see as innovators, versus who we see as mere workers, as disposable, as people who just need to be disciplined and kept in line. So our tracking system, again, in education, maps onto our class structure as well in the wider workplace and society. So this is just a way to say that I'm thinking about imagination as something that shapes so many areas of our life, not just the high tech, but our healthcare, our education, the way that we think of safety, who we imagine as a threat, who we imagine as someone who is an ally or part of our human family. All of these things require something that's in addition to policy and institutions and the legal structure that we need to grapple with. And my view is that until we can name something, we can't actively address it. So language itself becomes a technology that allows us to do certain kinds of things in the world. And so this is my contribution to expanding our social vocabulary so that we can reckon with these issues.
And in that sense, it's a radical idea.
I hope so.
Thank you. Thank you. Marietje, we were talking a little bit before we started about how if you identify as progressive in this day and age, sometimes you feel like you're more on the defense, really. You have to defend what we have in this renegade politics era. But we also need imagination to sort of figure out how we're going to get through all the things that are coming at us. And drawing from your experience in the European Parliament and also your current policy work, I'm wondering about what you consider to be the role and necessity of imagination in governance and in policy decisions.
Well, I think to some extent politicians or representatives are always imagining a different future because they have to address either harms that need to be corrected. Like I think your story is very powerful because I would not be surprised if the university blindly trusted the technology that they engaged, never thought about representation, never thought about the black person taking their exam, never thought about them being liable for violating the Constitution or should have been liable. And so that's a harm that needs correction, and I think it's great that you took action, but it's also responsibility of enforcement of laws that we have to work well. And the fact that it's so hard to know whether your rights are violated is actually a feature of the new technologies that we all rely on. And with generative AI, that's going to get worse because it's ever changing, it's highly individualized, it's very opaque, and even its creators, the main geniuses in the AI world, don't know exactly why it does what it does, so it's very unpredictable. And so these are the kinds of questions that first you have to imagine what's possible, and I often found this as I was trying to continue to educate myself about technology, because I'm actually not a computer scientist. I wish I was, I'm not. So I was always learning from people, because if we know what technology is capable of, then we can imagine the harms, but also the possibilities. But typically as a lawmaker, unfortunately, you have to look at what's not going so well, because if everything is going so well, then you don't need a course correction. And so I think it's part of the sort of daily work in many ways. But then the question is, one, how do you get access to the right information? I think that's a real challenge, and gets worse now with the way social media informs people. The power that tech companies have also is a power of framing our collective thinking about technology, about withholding or granting information that actually may steer those policy actions. The other thing I think I take from your question is people in the center, people who identify as progressives in the political realm, I think have a hard time imagining the tactics of their more radical opponents, like what it's actually about. So let me give one of the well-known examples. When a Donald Trump says that immigrants eat cats and dogs, the point is not that they don't eat cats and dogs. The point is that the field gets expanded, because it's such a completely outrageous example that, of course, it's not true. But because it's not true, then a whole bunch of other things that are equally crazy seem less crazy, because they are no longer the far end of the spectrum. And there's a challenge for people whose constituents don't want these kind of tactics, to battle those who do want these kind of tactics. So how do you fight polarization without increasing polarization? How do you address the political threat, the fascist or anti-democratic or racist or otherwise dangerous ideology, without stepping into their frames? And I think we, the broad center of society, including politics, have not always appreciated the tactics that we were subject to collectively, and are still reckoning with how we deal with it. And I worry about the synergy between those extremist political approaches and the role technology plays to help them, to increase polarization, because it goes viral, because people share, because it invites emotions that are strong, and that helps the tech companies. And of course, many of those are now not hiding. The CEOs are not hiding their true ideologies. They are, in fact, either very nationalist towards the success of Donald Trump, or they are very anti-European, or they are anti-democratic. And so there's a new kind of symbiosis between these political ideas and tactics and the role that technology plays. And if I were a city council member in Amsterdam or a member of the European Parliament right now, I would personally struggle to know where would I go to understand what field we're actually in, trying to achieve our own goals and address the harms that we think the people who put us in the positions of power that we are would expect from us. So it's, I think it's an incredibly challenging time where one of the solutions lies in getting more independent expertise to lawmakers, so that they can at least imagine the way the technology works, besides needing to wrestle with the new kind of tactics that their political opponents are using.
Yeah, so the entire system again is changing, and how do we get to the right kind of information to know the answers?
Right.
When I also think about the flooding the zone tactic here as well. If your
Sure.
zone is flooded, how do you know what matters and what doesn't? If
Yeah.
the scope increases, how do you know? How do you know what the parameters are?
All of that, yeah.
One follow-up question, just briefly, because it's so interesting that the work that you've done and how to link that to imagination. I'm wondering if you've ever encountered moments where policymakers or movements have used genuinely transformative thinking to approach governance. And what did that look like, and how did it make a difference?
Yeah, so it's actually not very common. I think that these very radical ideas are tested, or perhaps they are now, by what I consider my political opponents, because they're quite creative, to be honest, and we are quite shunned. So the biggest thing that I thought of, which I actually continue to think of as something extraordinary, especially when it happened, is actually the roots of the creation of the European Union as we know it. You know, imagine that this continent was completely destroyed, literally, by the Second World War. And the founders of what we now call the European Union thought, you know what, we shouldn't think in terms of punishment. We shouldn't think too much in terms of perpetrator and victim. Yes, there should be justice, but there should also be shared interest in our collective success. That's a very radical idea. And because we were talking about your book tonight, I thought, well, was imagination really a factor for these founding fathers at the time of the European Union? And I found a quote by Jean Monnet, who said, "Where imagination is lacking, people perish." And I thought it was so interesting, because it goes both to the imagining the worst, but also imagining the best. And so they were imagining actually something what was probably a dream at the time. And, you know, we're still struggling to make the dream a reality. It's hard work every day. But I do think that these people had a vision that was completely, past the incredibly difficult time post-World War II, that has created something magnificent, of course, and requires our imagination to continue to give it value and meaning, and to improve it in a world that is increasingly challenging it as well.
That's a great reminder of what we need right now, I think. The imagination to imagine alternatives coming from, our common values, what we all need. Robin, go back to you. As someone who bridges computer science, neuroscience, and activism, you have, I think, a unique perspective on how bias gets encoded into AI systems. Are you using imagination in your daily work? I know you've been inspired by Ruha, because you told us that in the call before we started this. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're doing that?
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not that imaginative within my work around tech or AI as much as I want to be, and I really strive to be that more. And because I was really thinking about this as we got to this talk, and I was like, when do I imagine fully across the scope, regardless of what I'm working on? And it's only when I'm already working in a context of where imagination is running rampant. So when I'm doing something around AI and creativity with a museum, or some sort of alternative way of constructing a exposition around technology, then my imagination is together with the people I work with. It's the essence of how we create something. I think also as well with the Racism and Technology Center, we really try to imagine a different way of approaching how we want the technological future to look like. And I say it with a bit of quotations, because maybe the future doesn't necessarily have to contain technology in order to be good. That's also a way of imagining. But in my work around computational biology, it's woefully unimaginative, and I try to put it in my work a little bit more as we go, and also reimagine that also those fields need to have imagination.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And you're the one person in this panel who has real roots in the Netherlands. Like you've been working here. You know the country so well. So I just wanted to ask you, how would you say the current state of imagination in the Netherlands is? Are we all trapped in the world of big tech and are all our zones flooded, or do we still dream?
Well, people laugh because I think everybody knows that Netherlands is like gewoon lekker gezellig, just keeping it humble, keeping it real. But there are little pockets of where, if we're talking about imagination from like a ancestral intelligence, as Ruha so beautifully calls it, or different types of AI. I heard this new word, allochtone internet, which is AI, which is made by someone who is also a migrant. But just to reclaim that way of looking at AI. So there are pockets of imagination of technological future, and one really good example I have is a collective called Radical Data. You should definitely look them up. There are two people creating, using imagination, that's their dance and art and different types of art forms, and they're using AI as a tool and not as a means to the end. And it's beautifully done and really showing like how activism and deconstructing colonial thought can really be done in a newly imagined way. But other than that, I wish it was more. I hope there will be, as we get towards this, that we collectively internalize imagination not as something that is a little bit spiritual and outside of our scope, but can be done as well when we are not necessarily creatives.
Well, of course, part of our country is artificial. And we've had to imagine survival in light of disaster for centuries. And so I think there's something there in terms of our collective creativity to find solutions. It's not always about, dreaming better worlds, but, in fighting against the sea and everything. So I don't know, just thought
of a very practical way. We went about it a very practical way, just make more land.
But we needed to imagine something, I suppose. Yeah, it's true. We have a practical imagination, perhaps.
I think that's very...
Us Dutch, yes, us Dutch. So, but imagination as a necessity makes me think that, Ruha, you said the humans behind the screen are missing. That's a point you were making in your presentation, and that really struck a chord with me as well. And I have this huge question that I hope you'll forgive me for asking. But would you say that the 21st century will be defined by the battle between man and machine, or human and machine? And how do we organize enough civic and or political power to come out okay on the other side? And Marietje, I'd love to ask you the same question, but let's start with you.
Yeah, so that is a big, 3 dissertation-worthy question.
At least, yeah.
I think that's a really interesting way to frame it, man and machine. And I think that there are certain investments in framing it that way, different kind of conclusions that we might draw if we think of it in those terms. What I think is that there are some men using machines to do battle against the wider body politic. So I think machines become a front. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why is it that, the story that's being told is that this artificial general intelligence is imminent? It's around the corner. It's going to do X, Y, and Z. Because some of the same people who are creating that doom narrative of this battle between man and machine, they're also quietly creating companies to create that so-called general artificial intelligence that they're warning us about. So there's a duplicity at play in warning us about something that you're also actively trying to create. And I think one of the ways to understand those warnings is that the more fear that can be generated about this imminent creation of this thing outside of humanity that's coming for us, the more that we have to then put our trust in those who seem to have the technical expertise about that. So it's a way of actually concentrating and coercing power by saying, this thing is coming. We know most about it. We know more than you. We have the technical know-how. So then we have to essentially defer to that expertise And so I think it's worth always sort of pushing back against any kind of framing that's making it seem like the technology has a life of its own, that's either going to help us, as I was saying, or more likely harm us, is this how this story goes? And ask ourselves, who actually benefits from that story? What does it actually do to our own power? One of the things I really want people to take away, whether they're reading Imagination and Manifesto or attending discussions like this, is a sense of our own collective power. That this way of concentrating in the hands of a few is really, something that we have to battle, not just in the realm of politics, but in the realm of our own minds and our own sense of our agency and what we can do, especially when we do it together. And this is not simply about sort of individual hubris and so on. It's about thinking about what it means to come together collectively, to have deliberation, to have debate, to argue, to not necessarily agree, but not to outsource these decisions. Definitely not even to the politicians that we agree with, but certainly not to those who are in cahoots and in bed with these tech oligarchs. And so really reclaiming our power is what I hope, and not to buy into this story of man and machine. Ask ourselves, who's behind those machines, always.
Thank you. It's, sticking to your sandbox of also the cultural and the way we look at society, remaining critical. I'm wondering, Marietje, how do you look at this question? Do you have a similar perspective, or perhaps do you offer a more political answer? Either is fine.
Yeah, I think maybe my answer for now would be slightly more philosophical, because I actually think that the way we have collectively embraced technology has already changed us as humans quite profoundly. And it will accelerate if we're not careful. So I actually agree that we have power, but we have accepted that for more efficiency or for entertainment or for, productivity gains now, or just not missing the boat and, stepping into the AI opportunity, etc., that we are just going along. And, we're talking about AI today as I agree we need to critically assess all the claims that are being made, but I do believe it will be a highly consequential technology. Then there's neurotech that will actually blur the lines between machine and human. We are all very much influenced by information that is fed to us by at least commercially incentivized platforms, if worst, more, anti-democratic or divisively motivated platforms. So I feel like we've already allowed machines to take a very powerful role in our lives. And of course, on a macro scale, this can intensify. Look at wars that are being fought right now. People point to Ukraine as an unimagined success of producing drones and having underdog advantage through this technological innovation. But of course, the use of AI or other kinds of data-driven targeting in places like Gaza, and thank you for speaking out against the genocide. I think we all really need to do more to stop what's happening there, which is, a stain on all of our humanity if we want to talk about humans. But the way that technology is already used to take highly consequential decisions, to alter power dynamics, to change geopolitics, to justify a ban on regulation. If you look at what Trump is now trying to do, he's trying to say to the US states, AI is so important for the success of the United States of America that federalism has to take a second part. I mean, we're at the John Adams Institute, so it's, I guess a good one to sort of reference. Maybe my slightly depressing conclusion is that the century is relatively young, but machines have been remarkably successful already.
Thank you. Yes, that's yeah.
I heard someone calling for Jesus. Maybe that's what we need.
Collective power. I mean, I love the idea, but then I wonder. It might be my own point. But how do we politicize this? Do we need a union for digital citizens? Is that something that we could come up with? We need to imagine how to do this, don't we? Yeah.
Well, can I say one? Oh,
absolutely.
I don't want to.
No. Please, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, one thing we really have to do is indeed politicize the discussion about technology, but not by making it a discussion about technology.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what alienates people. Everybody has thoughts about what their kids should do with phones, and everybody has a right to think about that. Everybody has thoughts about data in healthcare, you know. So we're all entitled and empowered to talk about it. But when it is a discussion about technology, politicians are so scared that even in this country, they just don't talk about technology, which is really crazy. We have another chance soon, more elections coming, but in the last election round, technology in terms of data protection, in terms of jobs,
literacy, around digitalization, how do you use it? What are the consequences? None of that was discussed.
Just not a topic. And I think that part of the reason is that people are afraid to say something stupid, which will then be shared in a viral video online saying how stupid the politician was. And we need to stop that.
Yeah.
We need to really say every politician can talk about this. You don't have to be a data scientist, however important these people are. You actually can talk about the role of technology in our lives, no matter who you are. And I think that opening up of the debate would actually politicize the topic, because then people may feel more invited to talk about it. Sorry.
No, don't say sorry. I love how passionate you are about this. It's important. Yes, of course.
This one, and you know, another kind of way to think about that same point is that these issues are too important to leave it to those who merely have the technical expertise.
Right.
So that's a way of saying not only can you, but you must. Because what we have right now in terms of all of these tech-mediated harms is that we've left it to those who merely have the technical expertise to create so-called solutions for societies in which they have very little understanding. So they have elementary understanding of the healthcare system, of the educational system, of what safety is, and yet they're creating all of these technologies and fixes for a world in which they have a very basic elementary understanding. And so this is another way of pushing back against the hierarchy of knowledge that we're all very familiar with. In our universities, we have this language of the hard sciences, the soft sciences, the humanities, the arts are in the basement. And that hierarchy maps onto a world in which some people feel so able to speak on any topic, especially when it comes to now technology, and everyone else has to feel very shy and worried that they're going to say something wrong. And so I want to encourage us again in terms of reclaiming our ability to be able to enter the debate, enter the conversation, is to say, oh, you only understand computer science, but you're creating an entire system for our healthcare system, for our politics, for this. I think it's time for you to be quiet, right? And so this is a way of flipping the script a little bit.
So let's not leave the future of technology to the techies. All right.
To add into that is to also flip the script on what expertise is. Because we're talking about, if you're a computer scientist, you have the expertise, but what about a single mother with 3 kids working 2 jobs? She probably has way more expertise about the needs within her community for what she needs, and how technology should be designed based from that starting point, compared to the municipality of Amsterdam that does some fraud detection algorithm and then rolls it out and it doesn't work at all.
And there's a wonderful initiative by a Dutch computer scientist, Sanai Gebrieb, who I was in conversation last night in Rotterdam, but his institute is based here in Amsterdam, and that's the entire basis of it, called Civic AI. It's about the knowledge and know-how of the civic sphere of everyday people to be able to collect the data that's most meaningful, shape the questions, and code the values. And so in some ways, this is a pioneering initiative right here in this locale that I hope that would spread to other places.
I mean, I love how you're deconstructing expertise and being really critical about the questions, and we're all bringing it back to civil power, which is amazing, but I'm going to go back to politics. Sorry about that. Marietje, your book lays out concrete solutions for reining in big tech, but so many of them I found depend on having robust democratic institutions that are willing and able to act. And I'm not so hopeful about those this day and age. Given the current state of governance in many places, how do we get from here to there? What do you believe is the path, perhaps, to building that political strength? And I realize I'm posing a huge question, but can you enlighten us?
Well, I think the biggest problem is, of course, the loss of the United States government in this battle, because they are not only stepping away from, adhering to democratic principles, but they're not even pretending that those matter anymore. So they're completely discarded now, and I think that's a big problem, especially now that U.S. tech is so powerful. There was a nascent moment of global governance happening, which was actually remarkable, where governments around the world were recognizing that they should claim a role for themselves to govern AI, where they probably failed around social media. I think it was really also a desire not to repeat that mistake. But there are still a number of democratic countries in the world that are also run by governments who see this unholy alliance of politics and tech power in the United States, which is actually, a threat to all other countries around the world that have heavy dependence on US technology, as we do in the Netherlands, because the risk that this technology will be weaponized to pressure, to intimidate, or worse, is real. And so I think it's a moment of an opening that can still go multiple ways. First of all, I think a lot of people in the US are worried and getting organized on a number of levels because of the very rapid unraveling of the rule of law in the country. I think one of the reasons why we're not seeing more mass protests as we did last weekend is because people are scared, and you're living in that reality on a campus. So the loss of the US is a very big loss, but it will hopefully also prompt other countries to work together better, and we're already seeing that. I mean, Canadian-European collaboration is stronger than it ever has been. Countries will have to band together to protect the democracy that we have, which has been in a steady decline over the past 20 years, which also happens to be the period during which tech breakthroughs were, a significant factor and feature in our lives and our societies. So, let the people who care about this push in the right direction, and also recognize that laws, and I think this is really important, are not instruments in the hands of governments. I think it's really important to appreciate, because what I often heard in Silicon Valley is, oh, you Europeans want to have a minister of truth. So you may not like big tech, but so you're going to empower your own governments to be censors. And this is now a favorite sort of mantra of the Trump administration too, that what we're doing here in Europe is censoring. And I think if you take a data protection regulation, AVG, for the Dutch people in the room, with all its imperfections, but it's a law that binds government behavior as much as it binds corporate behavior. And so I think solid laws actually protect people from the abuse of power, whether it comes from the state or whether it comes from market players or anyone else for that matter.
Thank you. So civic power and solid laws, those are things that are hopefully going to help us. I'm getting signs that I need to round up and give it the floor to the room, with, the mic to the room, which is great. One last question then for all three of us, or all three of you. And I think a question that's probably, a lot of people in this room have right now. What are meaningful actions for people like us? What's useful and what's less useful for us to do? How can we turn all that concern and indignation that we have into something constructive? Robin.
Organize. I'm an activist. So organize with your people, your community. I'm part of a variety of small and bigger communities that organize either in the neighborhood or in where we work. I hope to be an example of that you don't have to have a lot of individual power to create a collective effect. I was just a student and I did this from that position. And part of that reason that I got to do that, and people who have done similar things, is because they pushed through and decided to just take that and go with it and not be afraid of any repercussions. And of course, there are privileges that I have that allowed me to do that, and I'm aware of that. But I think it's easier than we think to organize and create that effect. And I know it's not necessarily immediately a good answer, but I really would like us to divest from Microsoft in our schools. I hate Teams. I bet you do too. And I believe that I could already create a way bigger ripple effect that also could be quite hopeful, I think.
Thank you. Organize and divest. All right. Marietje.
Change your own tech diet, start discussions at your job place, at the civic organizations, you know, the soccer club, the museum, wherever vereniging you are active. Join a political party is actually important. And indeed, see this moment of dramatic change as one that we can turn into an opportunity. And I think particularly for European tech alternatives, it is an opportunity. But it does require strong political leadership because, for example, procurement, you know, the purchases by governments themselves are significant. And so part of the reason why Silicon Valley is as rich as it is because of our governments, which is, you know, the irony of ironies. But it also means that we have significant leverage. The EU is a significant market for all these big tech companies. They may have, you know, strong words, but at the end of the day, there's significant money on the table here that we can move elsewhere. And so that means that creating European alternatives does not necessarily require new money, but it does require strong signals to the market. Meaning, if governments are going to step away from Microsoft, which they are in Scandinavia in rapid pace because they're very familiar with Linux there, for example, it sends a signal to the market. You know, investors want to make money, and if they understand that there's money to be made by new scaling opportunities by European alternatives, you bet they'll invest here. Even the Mark Andreessens of this world are heavily investing in Europe. So I think we must understand this moment as one that is informed by a sense of threat and urgency, but one that can create a lot of opportunity. And it's also necessary to look at it that way because people get paralyzed at all the dramatic stuff that's happening in the world, you know, new developments with the bombardments of Iran. Added to that, we need to also foster and tap into a sense of pride of who we are in Europe. Do not let people make us collectively smaller than we are. You know, I think there's really a sense in trying to celebrate what's beautiful about where we live, about kindness, about inclusion, about freedom, actual freedom of speech, and that there are also investors that may want to return to Europe, Europeans that have made good money in Silicon Valley, but that think that what is happening in the US is now a bridge too far. So let's tap into that sort of, you know, point on the horizon imagination of an alternative tech world that doesn't have to mimic Silicon Valley, in fact shouldn't, and that we can create ourselves. And I'm 100% convinced that, you know, with all kinds of civic action and positive plans to migrate away from our enormous dependency, we can do this. So I want to end on a genuinely positive note that this is also a moment of extraordinary opportunity.
Thank you.
Love it.
Yeah.
And I want to co-sign many of these really pragmatic and material dimensions of what we would do. And I also want to bring us back to the realm of culture and sort of underscore this idea that the facts alone will not save us. That is, you can read as many books as you want. You can try to become an expert in something in order to, as a prerequisite to feel like you have a say. But really, as human beings, we are storytelling creatures, right? When we think about how we actually learn, how we transmit information across generations. And I think I really want us to interrogate the stories that we've learned and the stories that we continue to tell, and not take them for granted. So even the idea of Europe and the European Union, even that to me is thinking too small. We are all on this warming planet, and what we need as we move forward is a planetary consciousness, to think about what would actually our children, our grandchildren, thinking through indigenous imagination 7 generations forward. In fact, they will look back and think, wow, you guys talked about yourself in terms of national identity? How cute. How little. Really, when we think about what do we owe future generations, is to expand our consciousness about our relationship to one another as people and as a planet. And so not to think small, even the things that we think of as bold steps, why can't we do for the entire planet what one continent has managed to do or still struggling to do? And I think that we want to be more ambitious as we are in terms of technology, in terms of biotechnologies, which is one of the places that I started my research. So many things we can imagine doing in the realm of technology is that when we come to society, then our imagination shrivels. Then we say, oh, we'll never be able to do that. That's too far-fetched. And that was the exercise. Let's take that ability to think creatively about the material world and apply it to the social world. Why can't we get past these certain hierarchies, presumptions, judgments about different groups and populations and understand essentially the oneness of humanity and start to make decisions collectively and ensure that our institutions also extend that consciousness into everyday life?
True to message to become our descendants' wildest dreams, as you say.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Could have gone on for hours, but I'm going to leave it to, where is Sean? Sean is there. To collect the audience questions, Sean, could you
I've been collecting
take
them
over?
all evening.
Great.
And I've noticed a particular theme. There's a lot of questions talking about
Thanks, that's sweet.
the capitalistic market system we're in, and just been trying to put them all together in coherent question. And a lot of them got down to the point of, can a profit-driven tech companies within the system we're living in realistically create AI that advances justice and well-being, or do we need to reimagine a new economic model to truly achieve value-driven technology?
No small question.
Yes. And I think it goes back to what both of my co-panelists said, is that the conversation about technology isn't simply about technology. It's about the economy, it's about politics. So that, in fact, there are groups already experimenting with other economic models as the basis of tech design. One initiative, you can go to the website called platformcoop.com, but it stands for Platform Cooperativism. And it's hundreds of different technologies that are being developed using a different economic model, a cooperativist model. And again, they're planting the seeds. It might seem fringe, it might seem small for now, but we have to start somewhere, right? Because certainly when the profit value supersedes all the other values that we might want to, shape tech design, we're always going to hit a wall. And so I think it's worth looking at these other experiments, whether it's platform co-op or, for example, in Barcelona, I've been learning about a participatory app called Decidim, which means we decide in Catalan. But again, it's something that was built using open source software, not relying on private companies. And it's a way for everyday people in the city to come together, virtually make decisions. And a lot of the city government's plans have been drawn directly from the deliberations that's happening on using Decidim. And it's been adapted and adopted in over 60 other cities around the world. So there are models out there for us to learn from and to extend and to grow in various places.
And to decentralize us from those profiting companies. There's this movement called slow AI, where people make their own AI and cater it directly to their needs. A good example of it is some students here in the Netherlands at the Film Academy. They created their own AI to render 3D images instead of buying into this very profit gaining company. They created something that works exactly as they need from within their own resources, and it's great. And that's one great example, but there's more. But slow AI, look it up. It's basically creating your own algorithm for your needs, and it disenfranchises your youth exactly immediately from these bigger tech companies.
Thank you.
We want to flip this on its head because we have a question as well from Judith Kallenberg in the audience talking about why we're not seeing a faster emergence of competitive alternatives here in Europe. Does that have to do with lack of capital markets, fragmentation of the single market? If we're looking at the realistic nature of how our economy is structured, why don't we see those sorts of alternatives emerging here?
European alternatives.
Sure.
Marietje, yes.
Well, so it's a combination of factors. I think we should not, again, be intimidated by all kinds of, caricatures of what the EU is. There's enormous talent here, a lot of AI talent, a lot of good companies, but there's indeed a difficult moment to scale, and there's a huge pull factor, which we'll have to see what happens to that now, but to go to Silicon Valley. So it's not just that companies are sitting here searching for capital and then thinking, oh gosh, nothing else worked, let's go to Silicon Valley. No, there's active recruiting, of course, by VCs too, who are trying to get them to come to the Valley. It's recognized as a sign of success if you can get US money. You know, it's really something like, oh, now you're really breaking through. And so we indeed need to strengthen the single market. Mario Draghi wrote a very useful piece in the FT after the first round of US tariffs, where he said, yes, this is bad, but the tariffs we have between ourselves are even worse than what the US is imposing on us. So we need to actually lower the barriers and create a capital markets union, meaning easier access to capital, more predictable landscape for entrepreneurs, including bankruptcy rules and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of homework that we can do and that I think we must do now. And the momentum again opens up right now, because if you are trying to get a visa to the US, it's not a given that you'll get it. Universities have now gotten the sign that maybe foreign students are no longer welcome. This means that there's a new momentum for us to attract talent. Of course, people who are in the LGBTQI+ community have felt under pressure for a long time additionally now. So there are enormous talents who may have various reasons not to be so happy in the United States anymore. I know that our government has done like a little something around it. If you look at what the French government's doing, it's just, grander signs. Perhaps it's very French, but we can learn from them. No, to really attract people to come here. We should not assume that these are all just organic moves of where people are going. There should also really be a sort of effort to get the right people here. It's a great place to live here. It would be good to have more talent coming here, and hopefully that's another opportunity that we can tap into.
Thank you. So momentum and hope, but we need to do our homework.
Always.
Yes, and we need to put in effort. I think one last question, Sean.
Yes, one common theme that came back just as capitalism did was ethics. And the question was, how do you teach your students, and what would you advise tech leaders about building truly ethical technology and ethical programming, not just technology that may appear ethical through clever marketing?
Is that a question you're interested in taking, Robin? Yes.
Unbiasing an algorithm is never going to be possible. So if an algorithm is made fit for all, it doesn't exist. Teaching students about the implications of using technology, not only LLMs and AI, but just in general, like how are you a good citizen of the internet is also something that we could learn. That's super important, but the idea that responsible or ethical AI exists, in my opinion, it doesn't exist, because technologically you cannot unbias your data set in a way that it works for everybody. So that comes back to the slow AI, makes things that only fit your needs, that work for just you and your community. And therefore, because it's so, you use so many resources, or you need to have your own resources to build it, you will be very careful when you train it and how you train it. Whereas now it's just trained haphazardly because the resources are there. So we're not research conscious in creating it. And I think the ethical part will come if we decide to imagine the world of a planetary citizenship, as Ruha said, but create algorithms or technology that fit our needs within our smaller pockets of our community.
Thank you. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it actually goes back to your story. You know, we think about ethics rather than as an endpoint, something that is about the product or, the end user, rather than the process, how we get there. So, for example, part of the decision against your case was to say, well, you were eventually able to take the test. Never mind the more, the duress you experience along the way. So ethics as something that informs our practice, our process, rather than some endpoint. And I think, like so many other things that have to do with our social relations, we rely too easily on our common sense. We think that it's, I think it's ethical or not. And we don't extend the same rigor to, let's say, ethics and other kind of more social concepts as we do to the so-called hard concepts that come out of STEM. So the same rigor and care that we apply to other ideas that are going to have consequence, we need to ethics. And so for me, practically speaking, in the classes that I teach, in the lab that I direct, so much a part of the process that I'm trying to inculcate is collaborating with those most affected by the oppressive status quo as knowledge makers, not as people who are simply going to benefit from whatever we're doing, but as upstream part of the process so that we're learning from communities who are experiencing surveillance or discrimination at the hands of technology, et cetera, listening to the knowledge and insights, as you said, that mother of three, not simply as someone who's going to benefit from something, but someone who knows something that we need to listen to. And to me, that's a key part of any ethical process, whether it has to do with technology or other realms of politics, because so often we're ignoring those most affected, or we're treating it more like charity. We're going to help the underserved, rather than in a solidaristic mode of how can we join arms and understand the kinship that we have and the knowledge that they bring to the process. So let that also inform our ethics and the way that we teach and relate to one another.
Thank you. And on that note, I would like to conclude this conversation. Thank you once again. Thank you so much to our speakers for sharing your bold work and your thoughtful perspectives and your valuable time with us. And many thanks to the John Adams Institute for bringing us together.
And our wonderful moderator.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. The floor is for Tracy, yes. We'll stay on stage. Okay, well then, I'm giving the floor to Tracy Metz, director of the John Adams Institute, who will conclude the event for us. Thank you.
With an unexpectedly optimistic note after this evening, I came in here thinking, geez, big tech is sort of like all the other really hard, big issues facing us now. Climate, the demise of democracy. What can these women tell us that will give us a sense of hope for the future? They did it. I'm amazed. I'm proud. I'm relieved. Thank you so much. Ruha saying we need to reclaim a sense of our collective power. And apparently we have more of that than I had dared to think. So Ruha, Marietje, Robin, also Ninka, thank you so much for that. I remember these examples that you mentioned this evening. Platform co-op, slow AI, civic AI, Decidim, Union for Digital Citizens. Ninka, I don't know if that was a joke or not, but why not? Let's do it.
Doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be.
No.
Collective of Radical Data, Robin, thank you for that. I really come away with this feeling like we're getting past the entertainment and the productivity boost that Marietje mentioned that tech have brought us, so that we've so easily given ourselves over to because it's so smooth, it's so sexy, it's so easy. And there are harder ways, but there are ways to reclaim this for us at this moment of what Marietje called a moment of extraordinary opportunity. So thank you all for making me feel better. And I also wanted to mention another very special thing about this evening. I've been with the John Adams for a long time. I was on the board for 9 years. I've been the director for 12 years, and I don't think ever before have I seen at my own institute 5 women on stage. So thank you. Thank you, Ruha. Thank you, Marietje. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Ninka. Thank you to our wonderful partners of the Rode Hoed. We love you. Thank you to Egon, who really has been loyal to us and supported the work of the John Adams for decades. decades. Never been a question, always you believe in us, you believe in what we do, and it's been such a fruitful collaboration, and I hope it will go on forever. Thank you also to the American Book Center, our new partner who is selling books outside, and I have a suggestion on that front. Ruha has a book, Marietje has a book, as Robin said, she doesn't have a book yet. But if ABC has bookmarks, why don't we all get Robin to sign a bookmark as a promise for the book that is no doubt coming? Will you do that, Robin? So for now, let's go have a drink together, buy a book, or get a bookmark signed together, and we will see you again at our season opener on September 4th in the Muziekgebouw aan het IJ with Nate Silver. Looking forward to seeing you there.